Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. I'm just showing this slide, Leslie, so when you do your intro, it'll be up and then I'll hide it. So thank you to all the presenters coming up next, and for Leslie Brown, who's moderating this next session on members and stakeholders. So over to you, Leslie.
Well, thank you. Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Leslie Brown, and I'm a sociologist at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session. And I thank the organizers and the contributors to this conference. It's really been quite amazing so far, and I know this session will be excellent. We have two presentations in this session. Daphne Rickson and Fiona Duguid will start us off on the subject of stakeholder engagement. And then Anthony Piscitelli, I hope I did that right, will be speaking in relation to his team's work on representing the cooperative democracy. So I'll turn it over to Daphne at this point. And if you could, I will give you a 4-minute warning, something like that. And if you could introduce yourself and perhaps Fiona.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here for this very interesting conference, or symposium, I guess I should say. I'm Daphne Rickson, and I'm an accounting professor at St. Mary's University. I teach undergrads, plus I teach in our Masters of Management and Co-ops and Credit Unions program. And I also am the executive director of our Center of Excellence in Accounting and Reporting for Cooperatives. A bit of a long name, but we call it CARC. So our presentation today is about, we're looking at the importance of the role of stakeholder engagement in cooperative governance. And we're looking at it through the lens of strategic planning, because strategic planning plays a very vital role in the governance process. It's basically sets the direction of the cooperative for the upcoming 3-year period. We used to do them for 5 years, but I think most strategic plans now tend to run for 3 years. So I think for co-ops particularly, it's really important for the governance process, as reflected in strategic planning, to make sure that the members are actually included in that process. So with our presentation today, we hope to be able to illustrate the difference between consultation and involvement, discuss how a greater level of stakeholder engagement can actually play a key role in cooperatives' adoption of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So the idea here is, maybe if other topics of the strategic plan don't actually capture members' interest, hopefully they would be interested in working with the co-op on UN SDGs. So we're hoping that we could consider how SDGs can actually help foster increased member interest in their cooperatives. Next slide, please. So when we look at stakeholder engagement, oftentimes I found through my research is that strategic plans are typically developed by management and then they're approved by the board of directors. The strategic plans are generally unveiled and explained by the CEO at the annual general meeting. So you might say, well, what is the problem here? Well, what I've been finding is that the boards are typically pretty much rubber stamping these strategic plans that are prepared by management. And there's really no mechanism for the board to ensure that they are truly representing the views of the underlying membership that they represent. So when you have a lack of involvement by the members, this often leads to a lack of buy-in. Next slide, please. So what does stakeholder engagement mean? We hear it used all the time, but it really extends beyond basically just the dissemination of information and participation in surveys and focus groups. The true substance of engagement is actually providing an opportunity for stakeholders to have a say in the organization by advancing their own proposals. So it's a two-way process. as opposed to the current kind of more or less one-way process that most organizations tend to use. So having a higher level of stakeholder engagement and getting members to be really involved would help the governance model be more inclusive and would also go a long ways towards addressing member apathy. Next slide. So what is stakeholder engagement? It's not just consultation. So when organizations say they're consulting their stakeholders, they don't really apply the concept properly. Now, stakeholder engagement is not as easy as it sounds. It actually can be quite complex, and it really has to be driven by the level of engagement that cooperatives are trying to achieve. So to explain this whole concept a little bit better, I'm going to use the ladder of stakeholder engagement, and it really is good at describing the nuances of stakeholder engagement. Next slide. So I know this may be a little bit difficult to read, but what this ladder does, it goes from the lower levels of stakeholder engagement. So the first three steps is more providing information. So it's pretty much one way, providing information via the web, briefing sessions, newsletters, etc., annual reports, and so on. Informing, it's level 3, so that typically involves when co-ops and other organizations are quite forthcoming in their annual report. So they report both the good news and the bad news. You know, what are some challenges coming up for the organization? Explaining, workshops would be an example of explaining. Application, this is reflected typically in the organization having an advisory panel, a task force, a focus group. So there is two-way dialogue before a plan or a decision is made, but there's no guarantee that the stakeholders' concerns would necessarily be addressed. Consultation in this framework is described as stakeholder surveys. And the one I have highlighted here in yellow, involvement. So this is where you give the, say, members an opportunity to kind of draft their own ideas as to what the organization should be doing or have in their strategic plan. So rather than just responding to something that the organization has prepared, they're actually advancing some ideas of their own. And collaboration and partnership, that's a higher level of involvement between the parties. And I'm not going to go into those in detail for this presentation. Next slide. So this presentation is done really in two parts. So the first part of the research that I'm going to describe is based on a case study that I did, and it's comprised of semi-structured interviews and documentary reviews. And I covered a wide range of topics. So performance reporting, strategic planning, stakeholder engagements were some of the topics I covered. I conducted 45 interviews with senior officials. So I talked to CEOs, VPs, chief financial officers, et cetera. People, you know, at fairly high level in the organization, from 23 credit unions, 19 Canadian, 4 US, plus 22 interviews with 3 very large cooperatives in insurance cooperatives in Canada, the United States, and the UK. Because they were so large and had so many different subsidiaries, et cetera, that's why I ended up doing, you know, so many interviews. And this information was used in a report that I did for the Filene Research Institute. Move it along. Yes. Okay. So this is what I found. So the first 3 levels were really reflected in pretty much the annual reports, the audited financial statements, the audits by regulators, et cetera. So that would be the first 3 levels on the ladder. So it's more like informing, one-way communication. Then the middle set here, explaining, placation, consultation, negotiation, it's more, I guess, token levels of participation. So with explaining, it's the annual general meeting where the CEO presents the results. a consultation. This was comprised of member and employee satisfaction surveys and a presentation of the strategic plan to the employees. So basically it was a done deed by the time it was presented to the employees. Negotiation, this was reflected in the organizations and the co-ops modifying some of their products and services to meet the needs of their members. Sadly, I didn't find any examples of involvement being used by the credit unions and co-ops that I interviewed. Not saying that nobody in the world is doing it. I'm sure there's people doing it, but just not in, the study. So that wasn't my, uh, experience. So, and at the higher levels, collaboration and partnership, there were some examples of the co-op working with the community on various community initiatives. So, so basically, to summarize, I guess, the high-level findings, so when I look at the ladder of stakeholder management engagement framework, the current level of engagement exercised by the co-ops really correlated at the highest to step 6, whereas a deeper level of engagement could be accomplished by moving a little bit up the ladder to stakeholder involvement and giving stakeholders an opportunity to actually have input into the strategic plan, to bring their own ideas forward rather than just reacting to ideas presented to them. So, certainly for member participation, it tended to be more passive than proactive. But, the co-ops themselves, the senior officials that I interviewed, they had the opinion that members are not really that interested in the plan and the overall direction of the co-op. Now, whether I'm not saying that's true for all co-ops, but it's certainly, what I found in my particular study. Okay, so we'll turn it over to Fiona Duguid, who will introduce herself and speak to her part of this research project.
Okay, thanks, Daphne. I'm about to bridge the gap here. So everybody who's able to see this slide at the moment, I just want to see maybe electronically, if you could just let me know if this particular group of icon symbols are familiar to you. So let's see if we have a thumbs up. Don't worry if you're not, or if you're on camera, give me a thumbs up, or a spray of celebration electronically, just to give a sense of whether folks on the line are familiar. Yes, we've got some in the chat. Great. Okay, so we have some people who are familiar with the SDGs. These are the Sustainable Development Goals as defined and signed off by 190 countries around the world to the UN as great. Look at the chat. Everyone is, people are really familiar. Great, great.
5 minutes.
Pardon me?
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And so this has become a framework that people are around the world adopting in order to start to think about how we can live in this world, with this world, thinking about planetary boundaries, while also thinking about the social, cultural, environmental, and economic impacts, right, for different cultures and people around the world. Okay. So with that framework, and with so many people familiar with it already, I conducted a study, and I'm going to whip through this really quickly because the main takeaways is that the co-op sector is not really talking about and embracing the SDGs. And I'm just going to show how I was able to jump into that so that Daphne can bridge our two ideas here. So I did a content analysis of websites and annual reports. This is one of the main mechanisms that co-ops engage with the public about what they are doing. And so in doing this, you can see all the methodological details here. And if you want to know more, I can fire you off a paper about exactly how I did this. You can see here that I picked the annual reports, the websites, and any other report where they could have been talking about, community report or integrated report. Okay, so what did I find when I looked at this, and how are Canadian co-ops talking about their actions around SDGs? Okay, so you're going to see here that very little is happening in Canada around co-ops talking about how they are implementing the SDGs. And even when I used a broader framework of sustainability, community, these kinds of things, very little is actually put out there. So when we think about the talking the walk, of which co-ops walk the talk really well, right? But are we talking the walk? And we're not really doing that very well in the co-op sector. That's basically one of our big takeaways here. So you can see that in general, the financial sector is embracing it more than the non-financial sector. And that may in fact be because there's lots of pushes within the financial sector that is helping them to move that in terms of competition from the financial sector. Okay.
2 minutes. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm moving through it quickly. So you can see here that very little are publishing this in their annual report. Very few non-financial co-ops are even referring to the SDGs. That's one of the big takeaways. Okay, so now we're going to compare this to internationally. So that was the kind of Canadian picture here. Internationally, what we find is that around the world, this is happening. The conversation about SDGs is happening far more and in a greater kind of way. Co-ops are connecting their activities, their impact directly to the SDGs. And you can see here that they're way ahead in terms of the Canadian co-op and financial and credit union sector. Although country context does seem to matter, because we did find very few in the US, although this may change with the change of the administration, of course. So a perfect opportunity to do this study again, to see how people have moved this conversation along. And as countries begin to embrace it more, do we see co-op sectors now embracing it more? Okay, so I flew through that kind of on purpose because what we really want to do is get you to bring these two ideas together. And I'm going to turn it back to Daphne.
About 30 seconds.
Okay, then I guess we'll just have to skip to the last slide, Fiona, just do the conclusions and not the discussion. So basically, what we're suggesting here is using the SDGs as a way to start to get co-op members more involved and more interested in participating in the governance process in cooperatives. So I think it would be too much to all of a sudden go out and invite stakeholder involvement in developing the full strategic plan. So the idea here is perhaps co-ops could start by inviting their members to say, look, what is your idea for how we can move forward on SDGs in our co-op? Obviously, they're not going to want to do all 17. What are the most relevant for your co-op? And try to incorporate some SDGs in their strategic plans, but not just management's ideas of what should be done. Here is an opportunity where hopefully, if anything was going to get the attention of members, hopefully it would be the SDGs, and let the members come forward with their own ideas as to what the organization can actually do on SDGs. So basically to help incorporate it into the strategic plan. So I think I've probably used up all of our time. So I apologize that I do have to leave a bit early. I had a bit of a scheduling conflict that I hadn't realized until yesterday. So my apologies again.
All right, thank you both very much. And good adjusting to the time constraints. Really appreciate it. So now we're going to hear from Anthony, who will introduce his team.
All right, sorry, just get the presentation up there. Hi, welcome. My name is Anthony Piscitelli. I'm a professor at Conestoga College. I'm presenting on behalf of my team. So first up is Adam Payler, who's at the University of Birmingham. He is also a research assistant working for me. He's actually getting his vaccine right now, or else he would be presenting with me. And then Dr. Geobey and Dr. Andrea Perrella were also collaborators on this research, and they're monitoring the chat, and we'll be hoping to engage you a little bit there. So before I kick my presentation off, one of the things I've really appreciated about this conference is how much we've had these really engaging chats in the sidebar. So we've tweaked our presentation and thought there might be some interest in answering one question, and I will disclose. I'm a chair of a cooperative, and I'm a vice chair of a credit union board. So I do intend to borrow from your great ideas here. So I'd love if you could toss in the chat if you've ever been contacted for feedback by a co-op, credit union, or a mutual organization for which you are a member. If so, how did they contact you? And I'm particularly interested in things that may be either driven by the board or done in a way where the board is the agency that is or the part of the organization that is likely to use the information. So that is the backdrop. This research comes out of a study that Sean and I did in 2020. It was a theoretical piece that we published in Answer J, and the piece looked at tried to identify a problem that I faced when I was actually a school board trustee, and when I experienced in some other boards, where the predominant governance theory suggests that the board's responsibility is to stay out of operational matters. Particularly as a trustee, and in other boards as well, I noticed that when I was contacted, it was almost always by a parent or a member of the organization that had some sort of operational concern. So we saw this as a bit of a conflict, and what we suggested in our theoretical paper was that the conflict didn't need to be a conflict, but board members could use that information, could act in a few different capacities. They could help guide people to get the information they needed to solve their problems, and they could also use that as information to help guide the organization as knowledge of trends, with the idea of from the paper, the book Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, and the idea that if people are upset, they could leave the organization, but if they're exercising their voice, it's because they have some loyalty to the organization, and that's much more useful information for the organization to act upon, because if you can get people who are complaining to keep from leaving, that's obviously going to make your organization stronger. Now, so this research is funded by SSHRC, and it builds on that, and the study that we got a grant for was to look at nonprofit organizations and cooperatives, with the major focus being on school boards, but then also a comparative piece. And we maintain that this work is particularly relevant for the co-op sector. And if SSHRC had fully funded us, we would have done the full project that we wanted to, that would have delved into that as well. But instead, we were left with just the comparison piece. But particularly around the second co-op principle, that focuses on democratic member control. So I would argue that this is really central to what is an effective cooperative movement, is one where the board is ensuring that the organization is exercising democratic member control. So what we did with this study is 38 semi-structured interviews with members of boards of directors. 25 of those were school board trustees, and then we have the comparison piece where we brought in co-ops, credit unions, and a few nonprofits across Canada. The interviews were conducted from December to January, so it is quite current information. We used otter.ai to transcribe it, which was useful and saved some time in transcription, but a little tip, if you're using it, it does create some more time when you start to pull the quotes, because you do have to keep your they're not perfect, and we did code that in vivo, and we used it for the scholars in the room who are interested. We used a grounded theory open coding approach to that. Now, fundamentally, what we ended up with was really kind of three clear findings that came out of this research that is really relevant to the cooperative sector. The first we found that there was a paradox, and that paradox was really, when we're comparing school board trustees who really did experience this tension between trying to represent the memberships and have that unifying single issue perspective at the high level governance at the board as a whole. So they did certainly, and this was my experience too, they did experience that tension where people were approaching them about very operational issues, but they recognized their role was at a governance level. What was interesting is when we started to bring in the comparison piece, this was not the experience of those on co-op boards. There were a few that highlighted some very minor issues, but nothing to the extent that this was very commonly discussed amongst the school board trustees. And now some of that may be a product of the nature of trustees and their election process. That being said, co-op board members are typically elected as well. Different levels of engagement don't necessarily have the profile in the newspaper every day, but for some of these smaller co-op organizations, I'm sure you're certainly, I would expect anyways, that you'd be hearing about some of these issues on a regular basis from your peers, but they did not appear to be the same extent of an issue here. Instead, what we see is that with the co-op boards is that professionalization, which we talked about a little bit yesterday, and demographic representation seem to be the driving perspectives behind selecting board members, and it wasn't representation in the sense of directly soliciting views, but representation in the sense of coming from a demographic group, and then and this can be problematic obviously, but then being able to speak on behalf of that group. There was a little bit of difference here on the co-ops and some nonprofits where directors represent a specific constituency. So those directors that have a specific constituency that they're attached to tended to be more similar to school board trustees in their answers. And this even occurred in cases where people representing the constituency were not necessarily elected, and they may have been elected, but they would be selected by the board, which you always often see that process where the board rubber stamps someone and then you go through the formal election process. So directors that fell into that category, even though they were appointed effectively to the role, they still felt a little bit more like school board trustees, and that tension of operations versus representing the membership. When we were looking at boards, we see that over time, directors of boards, as boards became larger and more complex, or as organizations became larger and more complex, boards tended to shift more towards strategy rather than focusing on operational matters. Now, this being said, the one area that boards felt that they wanted to pay more attention to even as they got larger, and this was one that they regretted sort of losing track of, was with respect to human relations. So human resource related matters within the organization was an area they saw as needing additional focus. And then the last finding that we had, and one that sort of summarizes a little bit of what I've said already here, is that when we were looking at co-ops and nonprofits, but mostly co-ops, and comparing them to school board trustees, the membership they represented appeared to have much weaker engagement with the board. When we looked at school board trustees, we saw there were many things that they were doing to actively really engage in with their membership. And when we're thinking of school board trustees, we're thinking of very large memberships, and co-ops run the gamut. But some of these trustees were actively hosting open forums where they were soliciting feedback from parents and other stakeholders, and oftentimes there'd be staff involved in these as well, and maybe collecting that information for some operational purposes, but it would often be the trustees themselves put at the forefront. We saw some places where trustees would go and visit all the school councils one at a time. We had school board trustees who were intimately involved in driving surveys of the membership. I haven't had a chance to scan what answers people managed to come up with, but I know with our co-op interviews, we didn't see this same level of engagement. And even in organizations that may be doing some membership surveys, we typically wouldn't see the board being nearly as involved in those as with school board trustees who were very actively engaged to the point of giving feedback on questions, making sure certain topics were covered. Instead, when we look at the co-op sector, we see that management appears to be doing most of the engagement, and you could even argue doing most of the actual representing of the members. And we would close by suggesting that these are trends that the co-op sector may want to think about, and actually flows nicely from our previous presentation. So I will close off there, and we've got the contact information if you wanted to reach out to any of us, but I can also post that in the chat if you want to send me a message, and there's our references. So thank you, and I look forward to hopefully having some time for questions.
Wow. I didn't even have to intervene. That's an excellent, excellent job. Okay, so I've been asked to provide a few comments, and I'm giving myself 5 minutes. So if you hear this beep, you'll know. So two quite different presentations, but what I found interesting about them is the first presentation kind of contextualizes this idea of engagement, and the second presentation gives us really concrete comparison, I think, that was very useful between the trustees in school boards and the boards of cooperatives. In relation to the first presentation, they emphasize that stakeholder engagement is a practice that is vital to cooperatives, and reminds us that beyond the members, there are other key groups within and external to the cooperative. So casting a wide net is important, but also being willing to consider that there will be disagreements and different priorities among the stakeholders, which can be intimidating. One cooperative that I've worked with was experiencing a crisis, and as they faced that crisis, they decided that employees had to be a major part of addressing it. And they also recognized the ways in which the cooperative was embedded in the community as the largest employer in the community, and so on. Rarely did they use the term stakeholder. Maybe we can get into a discussion about that at some point. This paper also talks about what is meant by stakeholder engagement, with the ladder of stakeholder engagement. And I just wanted to remind people that the ladder of participation was developed in 1969 by Sherry Arnstein, who was more of a political sociologist, or I think her official discipline was political science, who was writing about the relationship between citizens and their government, and about organizations and the relationship between leaders and the members of the organizations. The interpretations over the years of this ladder have become much more nuanced and multidimensional as researchers and practitioners alike realized that the different groups were appropriately involved and had influence in a range of different ways in different types of decisions, and that there was no kind of one model for each organization, or even for each type of stakeholder. Which fits with the contextual notion of engagement that this conference has been emphasizing. The strategic planning processes and structures, I just wanted to emphasize that there are now some models being used to help with that engagement process. But yesterday I was struck by Miriam Michaud, and I don't know if she's here, hope I'm not misquoting her, comment that maybe governance is not the right word, and maybe we should talk more about democracy. And that got me thinking, what might change if when we were thinking about governance in cooperatives, we used the term participatory democracy instead of democracy. That forces us to recognize that both direct and representative democracy have their place. Reliance on one or the other is inadequate, and adds other kinds of nuances to this notion of what democracy means. I really like the way the SDG reporting discussion speaks to the tendency of large Canadian cooperatives to publicly and in earnest connect with their movements, the movements of the society and of the world at large, which they are not really doing, at least in terms of the SDG. And encouraging cooperatives to see themselves as offering more than simply an alternative model of business narrowly defined. So the SDG opportunity is neglected, and we have empirical evidence to that effect. And I think part of the message is that cooperatives around the world can learn from one another. In the second presentation, this notion of a paradox was quite intriguing, and I would really like to hear more about that and to read the work. The notion of encouraging member loyalty as a way of giving members the freedom and the sense of their right to get engaged is really important. I'd like to hear more about these, the distinction between the boards and the trustees, and this notion that the trustees are located in constituencies and often have children in the school system and have concrete experiences with that, the notion that boards, especially as the co-ops get bigger, lose some of that connectedness and become more focused on operations and move into things like strategic planning, which, important though it is, again, needs to be understood in terms of the kinds of things in the first paper. If you move in those operational directions, how do you maintain a connection, and how do you support the cooperative ideals of democracy and participation? When I think I'm just about out of time, but when I was looking at some of this idea of representation, I was thinking about the ways in which a board can sometimes run into problems trying to be representative, and the question of whether or not a representative that is elected is meant to stay very attuned to the people they're representing and sort of argue their position, or whether at times as an elected official they need to maybe throw in some more of their own ideas. I was thinking about a co-op board, I'll end with this, was offered the opportunity to sell the cooperative, and it would have been quite lucrative. Oh, I've run out of that, but basically they refused to do it, and they even refused to take it to the members for discussion. And they argued that they had not been elected to sell the co-op. But many of the members afterwards were quite annoyed and angry that they'd taken that position. Anyway, now we're open for discussion, and I think some people have monitored the chat. I noticed, I don't know, let's see, there was one about what to do.
Leslie?
Yes.
Do you mind if I respond directly to what you just said there at the end? Because you really piqued my interest. So one of the things in the parallel, we did some quantitative work with this study. We're looking at the idea of a range, and we use the word trustee again, but there's a range in political science of how elected representatives should act, and it goes from the delegated model, which is this idea that you just represent the membership, to the trustee model, which is the idea that you're elected on behalf of the membership, then you exercise your own judgment. Mm-hmm. And most people would say that they expect their reps to fall somewhere in the middle. The piece that I think complicates it, which is really interesting, is that as board members, you're not a typical MP or an MPP where you're representing Parliament. You're actually elected as under corporate law. So at the end of the day, your primary duty is to the corporation. And I think that the interesting factor here is, and it brings kind of an additional element to that representation hat, is I think you also have to also represent, you can talk about it as an indivisible reserve, but this idea that the organization is more than just its immediate membership. It's also the founding principles on which it's based. So that co-op director that you said wouldn't bring it to the membership, I would say that the hat that they maybe were putting on was something that doesn't necessarily fit on that continuum, but one that is saying the best interest of this corporation is to continue its existence as a cooperative and to not lose that value. And I think that's really fascinating. And I don't have a clean answer on how a representative should do that. But I think that idea of really engaging with the membership and making sure that there's that constant dialogue, and you need to, as you get bigger, find more creative ways to do that, and it needs to be a priority. I think that can really help drive the decision making for the organization in a way, back to that idea of loyalty, that builds loyalty to the organization. What we've found in some of our other surveys is people aren't always interested in seeing, they want what they want to happen, but they can respect a decision they don't agree with if they feel like they were involved in that decision and that their view was actually carefully considered, but the organization decided to go in another direction. I'll close there because I know we don't want to have questions, but that was really fascinating.
I see a hand up. Jerome?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Hello? Yes.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you for these two interesting talks, and and also for your comments, Leslie. I would have liked to address my question to Daphne, but I guess she's gone. But nevertheless, just this notion of connecting the SDGs to notions of engagement. I really like this ladder of stakeholder engagement, and just curious if anyone has heard of the Jardin Environmental Fund, which I always like stories, narratives make concepts intelligible, and just the story of how this fund was developed. It was actually developed in exactly this type of member engagement, where the head of one local small cooperative bank in the network actually suggested this at the general meeting, and over a series of years was actually involved with researching actually how to develop some criteria for sustainable investment. And it was the first ecologically or environmentally based investment fund in the world, and so it's very interesting, even before these SDGs were around. So just that as an example of member engagement, as well as this notion of connecting investment to things like the SDGs, although this was before those were even around.
I might just jump in and say, absolutely, two big pieces around this. That co-ops are doing great things that align directly with the SDGs. We can all attest to this in different kinds of ways, the anecdotal ways, the maybe there's something that they're tweeting out or something, right? The one of the big pieces that is missing from this maybe is the talking about it, and what we certainly see is that the credit union sector, with Desjardins and Vancity at the lead of this for sure, in terms of talking about sustainability and the SDGs, for sure. But for the most part, the rest of the co-op movement in Canada is really slow to take up. I love what Leslie said, is sort of missing this opportunity to connect with the SDGs as a sector to be able to. And this may be because people just haven't embraced the framework. It's not a part of their strategic plans, perhaps. It hasn't really trickled down into their members' sort of lexicon and how they understand the world around them. Maybe also they're not collecting any data that would then be able to speak directly to the SDGs. So having a tool or something in place that would help them to be able to talk about it in a more concrete or quantitative or qualitative kind of way. So thanks for bringing the Desjardins example forward, Jerome.
Okay. I don't see any other hands up. And if someone else was monitoring the chats and found something I didn't see, would you let me know? But I did see where am I? Sorry. I did see a question around making a distinction between interference and connectedness, but if the person who did that could speak up, I'm not exactly sure I understood the context of that.
With me, I'm Fred. it's the membership engagement, governance effectiveness in terms of voice representation, representativeness, and expertise requires as much connectedness as possible between board work, governance work, and operations without board members taking over the role of managers. In the connection, communication, dialogue, other kinds of fora for members, employees to get involved with various governance issues. Is involvement, is connection, but it's not interference. I don't know if that was at all coherent, but.
All right. Any comments on that from the presenters?
Yeah, so the one piece I'll note, and this came mostly out of the trustee roles, one of the themes that emerged in that, and it's one I think the co-op sector could adopt, is this idea of system navigation. So this puts a position where trustees or directors can have access to really operational questions from the membership. And in those circumstances, they don't view their role as resolving that issue for the member. They view their role as helping that member resolve the issue. So it becomes about navigating them to the right person. Sometimes when you're dealing with marginalized community, involves helping that community member advocate for themselves, sitting in a meeting with them, showing that they support this position. But you need enough respect in the organization to recognize that when they're doing that, they're an individual, they're not speaking on behalf of the board as a whole, they're not trying to interfere in operations, but they're trying to create an organization that really values all of the individuals within it and tries to do the best for them. So I think that system navigation idea is one that probably hasn't even been formally adopted by school board trustees as a thought, but it is one that is clearly being done there. And it's one that I think would be really useful for others in the co-op sector to pick up as a formal lens and maybe even write into policy.
Thank you. I see a hand up for Oyer Imaz.
It wasn't intended, but I take the the chance to make a question. I was very happy to listen you talking using references directly from political sciences or democratic theory without assuming as such the firm state analogy, because I have seen like, okay, take us as an assumption that the firm is a state, so we can talk about democracy in a firm as if we were talking about democracy in the state. However, it's maybe part of my own ignorance. My feeling is that we don't make it a lot use actual discussions in the theory of democracy or political science to inform our debates on cooperative governance. So I would like to know your take on that. If you feel it is like that, and in that case, why?
So you're asking me, or?
Yeah, well, it can be for any one of you, but yeah.
The speakers do.
I think this one might be in Anthony's space.
Yeah, I think it's Anthony or Leslie, because we have made the just thinking about the representation and the role of board members. We tend to forget that finally they are regulated by the corporate law, so that their role is defined by a law that is not actually thought in terms of democratic theory. So I was just wondering whether you agree in terms that this translation is somehow rudimentary of tools in democratic theory to the discussion on cooperative governance, and why it is that there is not a dialogue between these two fields in the theory.
Yeah, so a lot of the framing that we've used is around agency theory, which I know others have already talked about, so I won't rehash. But I certainly think one of the challenges is the legislation for co-op boards, school boards, even municipalities, is all around framed really around agency theory and not around democratic governance. So I think there is room, though, for us to consider some of these democratic pieces. And I would suggest, and this is where this idea of exit, voice, and loyalty can be brought in. And this is me in a way sort of shoehorning agency theory to basically say it's in the best interest of the organization, and the role of the board to ensure the organization is acting in the best interests of the membership because it fits that legal landscape. I'm not a lawyer, but that's how I think about it in my mind. So the basic idea here is that organizations who lose members instantly lose that voice, and if you lose members without knowing why they left, there's nothing you can do about that. So who are your most important members? The ones who are complaining, because those members have enough loyalty to the organization, might be forced loyalty because they don't have another choice, or it could be loyalty because they really care about your organization, that before they're going to leave, they're actually going to complain. And to me, trustees, directors are a great avenue to give people an outlet to voice those complaints. And it's an outlet that fits with the agency theory idea, because the fear is if the complaint goes to management, they may not care because they'll view it as a direct criticism on their work. But if the complaints come into the board, then the board can determine, maybe this is operational and maybe I can help you solve it. Or maybe this is an overarching theme that is a problem within the organization that we need to think about with respect to our strategy, with respect to our values, maybe with respect to our management team, to see if we can address that. So I think that the democratic piece can fit even within the corporate landscape that we've been designed. And I think it certainly would make boards better off in terms of meeting the organizational goals if that becomes a priority. Does that answer your question, or did I take it on a tangent?
Yeah. It does.
Any more questions? Just to leave with one comment, I guess, about that. A study that was done called Making Membership Meaningful across 5 different countries, including Canada, came to some rather interesting conclusions around how to employ participation as something that would prioritize the notion of democracy in its various nuances. And I won't go through the recommendations that came out of it, but they were very similar to the recommendations I hear coming out of the conference. And I think the question of the role of democratic theory is really interesting, particularly given what we've been hearing about the increasing restrictions of at least in some contexts, of the understanding of what a business is, the understanding of corporate law as it applies as it develops in relation to cooperatives. I was reminded of an experience with a very, very participatory cooperative that was speaking to a highly sophisticated and excellent credit union. And the co-op had constituted itself without incorporating, and was doing all sorts of things that the credit union was saying, well, wait a minute, how can you engage members that much? And ultimately that cooperative did incorporate, and it did make some rather dramatic changes to the way it behaved. So that's, I guess, a contextual factor as well. At this point, I just want to thank everybody that